Today, I want to talk about one of the mortal sins of writing: infodumps. For anybody who's new to this channel, my name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author. I like to make YouTube videos about writing stuff, and we are almost at 1,000 subscribers. Do me a huge favor, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment down below letting me know what sort of topics you would be interested in hearing about. But let's get right into this. Infodumps are one of the most insidious challenges that a new author has to overcome. I mean, have you ever read a book that just looked so interesting? It had a gripping cover, maybe the blurb was fantastic, and you were really intrigued by the idea, and you opened it up, you get through the first couple of pages, and then all of a sudden, all of the life just starts to drain out of you as the author drones on and on and on, telling you all sorts of information that I'm sure they think is really cool, but just drains the life out of the story. Maybe you've read something and the elaborate explanations of why things are the way they are just start to grate on your nerves after a while. I know it's happened to me. Even more embarrassingly, I know that I've written that way. In fact, if you go back and look at a lot of my early books, I infodump a lot more than I should. Now, what is an infodump? An infodump is really when the author conveys too much information for the reader. Now, this doesn't mean that authors should never convey information and that you shouldn't tell your reader something important about maybe the backstory of a character or the history of your world. But it's very important to understand that readers have a certain tolerance for information. And infodumping is when you as the author, or me as the author, when we exceed that tolerance. In fact, few things will make a reader drop a book faster than infodumping. And that's because infodumps simply aren't interesting to read. No matter how fascinating the information might be to us as the author, it's just not that interesting to people who are reading it. I mean, I was super guilty of this when I started writing, and it's a very common problem that people face. So the question is, how do we as authors convey the important information that we need to get across to our readers without just dumping it all on them? I like to use what I call the drip feed method. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about drip feeding your world building or drip feeding the context of a story for your reader. A drip feed is simply a device that releases liquid at a slow rate, usually one drop at a time. And we can do the same thing with the important information that surrounds our story. Again, whether this is world building, whether this is character backstory, or even just context for a current struggle that your character is facing, we can give our reader this information a little bit at a time. So the first thing we want to do is we want to drip feed our information. And we do that by making everything that we are sharing bite-sized, we make it contextual, and we make it relevant. So what do I mean by those things? First of all, we make everything bite-sized. If it takes longer than a sentence to describe or introduce, it's probably a little bit too long. Now, some of you are going to be saying, well, hold on. I've got this incredibly complex and rich history to my world. How do I deliver that in a bite-sized piece, in one sentence? That's just not possible. And you're right. But what you can do is you can deliver it in a lot of one sentences spread throughout your whole book or your whole series. And when it's delivered that way, it's like bite-sized chocolate. If you were to just be like, here is a pound of chocolate, eat it, most people are going to be like, that's a lot of chocolate. But if you were to take that same pound of chocolate, cut it up into a lot of little pieces, maybe put them in individual wrappers, and then hand them to somebody one at a time, you'd be surprised at how much they'll actually eat. By chopping our complex backstories into small, bite-sized pieces, we make it easier for the reader to digest that information. And then the second piece of that is that we want it to be contextual. We only want to share information that's important to what's happening in our story. If you have 1,000 years of history to this empire that your character is exploring, that's great and all, but why do they care? And if they don't care, If your main character doesn't care, the reader's certainly not going to care because they are reading about the character, not this empire. So by contextualizing the information, by sharing only what is important to the characters in your story, you can make all of the information that the reader is getting more palatable. And then finally, you want to make it relevant. Now, how is this different from contextual? Well, the information you want to share needs to be in the context of your story, but you also need it to be relevant. Because some information, while maybe important to a character, is not relevant to the plot. So not only do you need the information to be contextualized to the characters, but you also need it to be relevant to the plot of the story. And if it's not relevant to the plot of the story, and the characters aren't directly experiencing it, and it's not bite-sized, it's an info dump, and nobody's going to want to read it. But again, you can take that info dump and you can chop it up into pieces. You can make sure that you're only sharing information that your characters are going to directly interface with, and you can make it relevant to the continuation of the plot. And if you do that, people will love it. Now, a great way, practically speaking, to do this is to show information rather than tell information. We can do this through the inclusion of things like customs. Let's say that you want to share information about a particular religious order. A way that you can do this without just info dumping on your reader is when your main character comes into the city for the first time and encounters a member of this religious order. Maybe they see them giving alms to the poor, or they see them begging for alms for their order. If you create an interaction between your main character and the member of the religious order you want to talk about, it becomes incredibly easy to share information about what's going on. You have contextualized it by making it something that your character is going to run into. You've made it relevant to the plot because there's going to be an interaction between those two characters, and you can keep it brief, revealing little pieces over time as opposed to dumping everything at once. And finally, the last thing that I'm going to encourage you to do is to play off of the familiar. So in the example that I just used, we had a member of a religious order who is asking for alms. Now, most people have encountered someone who is asking them for money on the street, whether that's somebody who's disadvantaged or somebody looking for donations for the disadvantaged. So all of your readers are going to have that context for what is going on, what kind of interaction it is. And you can play off of that to cut out some of your info dump. You don't have to say, well, this religious order stands on the street corner and asks people for money so that they can take care of the poor and the needy. No, you can just show them doing that. And because your readers already have context in the real world, you can use what's familiar to them and tweak it slightly to clearly identify what's happening. And so in that regard, you can actually shortcut the process of passing information because there's familiarity there already. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that you can take some of those examples and you can apply them to your own writing. When you can get to the point as a writer where you are not just dumping information down people's throats, you're going to find that people respond way better to your stories.